Hi, Michael Kushner here. It's time for another episode of HOA Hell. With me today is Senior Associate at MBK Chapman, Sam Kill. Sam, hi.
Hello, Mike. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for being here again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Today we're going to talk about an issue that is relevant to our everyday lives as attorneys in this area. Mm-hmm. This happens every day. It's one of the most common interactions between homeowners and their HOAs, and that relates to parking.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I call it the parking wars, but parking is a big issue. We're going to cover it all today. Mm-hmm. We're going to cover parts of parking that HOAs are allowed to control and where it crosses a line and what they're not allowed to do. We're going to talk about towing. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about the types of vehicles that they can ban and the types of vehicles they can't ban. We're going to talk about what kinds of parking rules are enforceable and which ones aren't. Mm-hmm. We're going to cover what your rights are before they can ever tow your car, because HOAs can fine and tow cars, mm-hmm. but they got to follow the law. Okay, so we're going to talk about all that today. We're going to talk about how you push back when there's an unreasonable fine or unreasonable enforcement or unfair enforcement, like selective enforcement. We're going to talk about your remedies and what you can do to push back and fight back and even that power imbalance. Okay. So let's start with a broad overview of parking authority by an HOA in California. Sam, give me a broad overview of parking authority by an HOA in California.
Well, in California, HOAs have the authority to reasonably regulate parking within the community, and it can actually also extend to regulating street parking, overflow parking, guest parking. Well,
the street parking is going to be limited. We'll cover that later because that's actually quite limited. But they can control parking.
Right.
Yes, it's your property. Yes, it's your driveway. If you have your own driveway, it's your driveway. But the HOA can still regulate.
Right.
Their HOA can regulate the streets if they're private streets inside your community, or even if they're public streets inside your community.
Exactly.
If they're owned by the city, but they're under HOA maintenance and HOA authority, they can still. There's certain regulations, but it's a little limited.
Right.
But the bottom line is they have a right to regulate. And by the way, that's not a bad thing. For those of us who live in an HOA, there are certain, I'll give you an example. I don't ever want to have a neighbor have a rusted old car with no wheels on blocks in the front lawn.
Right.
I don't want that.
Yeah.
But in a non-HOA community, there's very few municipal codes that would ban that. Mm-hmm. And so, there's a neighborhood just a mile from mine that is not governed by an HOA. And they've got, you drive down through that neighborhood and there's RVs parked on the lawn, unworking vehicles parked on blocks. It's ridiculous.
It's a visual blight. Yeah.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
So I want that sort of control. I like that. I bought into that, okay? Because it'll help keep my property values high, which is what I want.
Right.
But it's got to be within the law, okay? So HOAs can't utilize mechanisms, right? So they can control, but there's certain things that the law has never given them the right to do. So let's get those out right now.
Okay.
An HOA can never put a boot on your car.
No.
That locking wheel thing.
Right.
Okay, they can't do that. That is not within their purview. It doesn't matter what your CC&Rs or rules say. They can't do it. They also can't do that thing that goes on the windshield.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that locks onto your windshield and blocks you from driving the car. They can't do that. It's the same thing as the boot. Okay, so they can't do they can't add something to your car to make it undrivable. But here's some of the basic things they can do for sure. They can require that any car parked in the community is
registered,
the common registered year.
Right.
Now, if you have a car in your garage and it's in the garage and it's not registered, that's fine. They can't prevent that. Okay, they can't prevent you from working on your car privately in your garage. They can't if you move it out to your driveway, they can stop you, but not if you're in your garage with the garage closed. They can't stop that. Right. Okay, but they can require registration. They can require that be working. They can require that your car isn't stored. It's got to be driven, right? So if you have a car that never moves and it starts collecting dust and those pine needles pile up behind the tires, that's a problem because that's ugly. It's gross and it gets dirty, and you can tell a car that's not been driven. You can tell. They can require you to move the car and actually drive it. Okay, those are all things that I don't have a problem with.
Right.
Okay. But again, they have to follow the confines of the law and their governing documents, and they have to impose those fairly. We're going to get into a lot of that later on, okay? So, give me some of the things that are commonly an HOA will control. Give me some of the things, like guest parking. Talk to me about guest parking.
Well, guest parking, they can control the location of it, where exactly that location would be, whether it's like street side or a corner of a community. They can
reserve certain spots for guests.
Reserve certain spots for it. They can control the duration of it. Oftentimes, we see this frequently. It's limited at 72 hours. That's a norm. They can control, for instance, that the homeowner, the member, actually not so to speak register, but kind of submit information relating to any extended parking by guest.
Right.
They can do that.
If they have
That's
a guest
reasonable.
staying for a week or something.
They may not have the placard or the sticker, but they can call it in and basically.
And can they also? They can also tell homeowners you can't park in guest spots. They
exactly.
Can do that,
yeah. Right.
Okay. Yeah. And can they control whether or not you can park on the street?
It's a qualified. Yeah, I mean the short answer
for
is
the most part.
They can to some extent, but obviously it's subject to jurisdictional elements. Is it a private street, public street? Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So,
and they can park. They can also control the kind of vehicles, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Some HOAs don't have any restrictions on, for example, commercial vehicles.
Right.
Some have restrictions on commercial vehicles.
Many do. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Most do.
Right.
Some control. Some actually call a commercial vehicle. You have a normal vehicle that becomes a commercial vehicle if you put one of those magnet thingies on it. So what you got to do is take the magnet thingy off, and now it's no longer commercial. Right. Or the truly commercial vehicles, like the trucks that have the built-up things where you put the ladders and everything, they can ban those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they can ban those.
Right.
They can ban dualies, for example, the double wheel thingies, and they can ban sprinter vans.
Exactly.
Right. Length, usually over 18 feet, something like that. They're well within their rights to do that. What they can't do anymore is they can't ban. They used to be able to ban all pickup trucks.
Oh, yeah.
Years and years and years ago. But pickup trucks became so ubiquitous and normal as everyday driving vehicles that the law actually changed. Mm-hmm. So HOA cannot ban pickup trucks. They can ban pickup trucks that weigh over a certain amount or that are over a certain footage or that have the double tires in the back.
Right.
Okay. Or the weight, right? Mm-hmm. Because those are certain commercial vehicles will all have those characteristics. So they can do that. They can ban you from having your regular sedan if it has the business name on it, logoed. They can ban that. So you got to take that logo off, which is why people do magnets. They can stop you from, if you work at Domino's and you've got your Domino's thing on, you got to have to take that off. Mm-hmm.
And it goes without saying RVs and boats and
recreational
trailers.
Vehicles. Yeah. They can't ban motorcycles, but they can ban dirt bikes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. They can ban ATVs. They can ban, parking. Now, RVs, what they can't do is ban it for short periods. Like, you have to be able to drive your RV and pack up the house and all that and leave it for 24 hours.
Right.
So they can ban it anything beyond 24 hours. Mm-hmm. But they can't stop you from keeping it overnight because people are leaving, right? And there's nowhere to go. Mm-hmm. And they need their vehicle there so they can drive out because they can't block egress and ingress. Mm-hmm. That's the bottom line. Okay, so bottom line on what the HOA can do is they can regulate. But the regulations have to make sense. They have to be reasonable. That is under the Davis-Sterling Act. And they have to be equally enforced against all the homeowners. They cannot be selectively enforced. That goes with any rule regarding anything, especially parking. Mm-hmm. Okay? Let's talk about a couple of examples, though, where HOAs went completely off the deep end. Mm-hmm. Let's do a case study. You can look this one up for yourselves in the papers. Garden Park Village in San Jose.
Yeah.
Okay? So I'm going to take you to Garden Park Village in San Jose, and you can Google these facts, as I said. Feel free to do that on your own. The HOA at Garden Park's a townhome community, and earlier this year, 2025, we learned that for the past year or so, the HOA had not only installed a number of surveillance cameras in common areas, but there was a sea change in their enforcement policies for parking. Now we're talking about they had rules regarding, parking on in front of a driveway because that's not a designated spot, right? And you're blocking a driveway. And guest parking in this community, by the way, is 50 yards away. It's a good walk. Okay, so they started ticketing people. And these fines started at $150, $100, I think. Started ticketing people that stopped their car for 30, 45 seconds or a minute to pull groceries out, run them inside the garage, and then go and park somewhere, right? they started ticketing these people. And they were doing this because of the surveillance cameras. Okay. They specifically put them there so they could increase their monetary grab. It was a money grab. Okay. Now, so in blanketing this community with these surveillance cameras, paid for by everybody, okay? And now that I'm looking at my notes, it was $175. It was $175 per parking fine for these things, okay? Apparently, some homeowners, in a very short period of time, before they even knew about the first or second, they would rack up like $2,000 worth because they were treating each of these separate event. So they would send these notices out, and all of a sudden somebody would say, "We saw you park in front of your garage to get groceries or to dump your groceries out. Then we saw you park in your driveway for overnight once, and then we saw you park in the street for whatever." Okay, so that was 175, 175, 175. Completely abusive.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I mean that gets to the point of absurdity. So they also, not related to parking, but it's just the same surveillance cameras. In addition to that, they started getting landscapers or employees or vendor contract employees to even climb up on top of ridges and some of the HOA buildings to look into people's balconies to make sure they were complying with balcony provisions about, certain things that could be on the balcony, let's say, that you couldn't possibly have seen from the street. Okay? Could not see it from the street. They had to go onto rooftops and look into people seeing with binoculars to catch that. That's the sort of tactics that this HOA was using. So one person, specifically somebody that had stopped once to unload groceries for a minute, just enough to get into the garage and then get back. And the reason she tried to explain at the hearing is that she's not strong enough to carry all the groceries, and she would have to make multiple trips, 100 yards away or whatever, to the guest parking, just to bring her groceries over. When all she wanted to do was get out of her car, motor's on. She's not parking, by the way. She's stopping. There's a difference. She opens the door, gets all her groceries off, puts them right there next to the door, and then gets in the car and goes in the proper place. Fine. And the HOA wouldn't budge. So she was not allowed to leave her car in front of her own garage for that minute or two. Okay? There was even a person who they get back, somebody's parked in their assigned spot. Some people had garages, some didn't. The ones that don't have assigned spots. This person came home. Somebody's parked in their assigned spot. So they go and they pull over, I guess, on the, where you're not supposed to park on the street temporarily so they could go inside and find whatever phone number they need to find or go and call somebody. And they got fined for that because somebody else was parked in their spot and they couldn't park there.
Ridiculous.
And the HOA didn't care. The HOA didn't heard them at the hearing and then fined them. So several of these people got fed up and they said enough's enough. But the straw that broke the camel's back was, so remember the lady with the groceries in front of her garage just for a minute or two. Well, one gentleman, it turns out he was called to a hearing and he's like, I have no idea why, because my car is in my garage. Somebody, not in his family, parked in front of his garage, in the street, in front of his garage, which is not legal parking. And he was sent the fine letter for the hearing, the warning, or not a warning letter, but a letter to come to a hearing because of illegal parking. He goes to the hearing and says, hey guys, that's not my car. Y'all know what I drive. And that's not my family member's car. That wasn't a guest. That's not ours. I don't know whose car it was. I don't know everybody in the world. So I don't know who's driving that car. They didn't care. They fined him. So he got together with a few of these other people and they...
Good.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Okay, and it was so absurd that it became news. Okay? And there's a San Jose newspaper article. I can't remember the name of the paper.
Mercury?
Yeah, I think it was the San Jose Mercury News. There's an article about it, and I think it's in April of this year, 2025. So, that's the parking wars. That's when it gets... That's extreme, okay?
It's laughable.
That was a new one for me. I hadn't seen that before. So let's talk about the most egregious thing that an HOA can do, and then we'll go down from there. Okay? Towing.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? HOAs can tow, but they have to comply with state law. Okay?
Yeah.
And there is a code section in the vehicle code. Do you happen to know that off the top of your head?
Yeah, it's Vehicles Code Section 22658.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And roughly,
Yeah.
what does that require?
Well, it requires that you have visible, conspicuous signage of a certain size displayed.
Certain font too, yeah.
Right, displayed at, let's say, at the front of the community, at the entrance, where people can easily see it.
And where the parking, where it's in effect.
Where the parking is, where it's in effect. And then it has a 96-hour notice requirement prior to any towing. So even if you're in violation, you are to wait 96 hours before you commence a
Not
tow.
always.
Okay.
I'm gonna call you on that just as a little bit of a tweak on that.
Okay.
If a car is parked in somebody else's spot,
Right.
you don't have to wait 96 hours. They can tow it immediately.
Right. Exactly. Right. Yeah. No, that's true. I should have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If they're parked in a properly parked,
Mm-hmm.
no, it's not proper. If they're the 96 hours doesn't come in, I think you have to have the signage up. I think you have to have the policy in place because you can tow somebody for being in somebody else's spot. If they're in a fire zone, in a red curb, you can tow them.
Yeah, I should have qualified with if you're in let's say like in a guest spot or a space that's not designated or assigned to anyone, or it's not let's say a handicap or disabled parking.
Right.
In those instances, I mean, that nuance kicks in, and most people don't know. So, for instance, the 72-hour mark, if they have signage and it's a guest spot and they go ahead and commence a tow, that's typically something that you can challenge.
Right. So the notice, if you were properly parked in a guest spot when you got there, but you're supposed to leave after, sometimes the guest spots, like you're not supposed to be in a guest spot after 9 p.m. unless you're registered. Like overnight guests, their owner has to call in their license plate and say, I have a guest staying overnight. They're going to be that. Then you can stay overnight. But a lot of these places, you can't do that. You have to be gone by 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. unless they have your license plate in the management office or the management or the tow company, right? In that case, your car's there for several days. Then you got to wait that 96 hours, okay? But if you're parked in a spot you aren't supposed to be in, there's no 96 hours. I think that's the way to differentiate.
Yeah.
Now, without that sign, and the sign doesn't comply with the vehicle code section, there's no tow, okay? There also has to be, you have to be under contract with the towing company. There has to be an actual contract because they have to know what the parameters are for the towing.
Right.
Okay. Now, what happens if an HOA tows somebody's car wrongfully?
Well, they're in trouble.
Yeah.
You can seek reimbursement and any damages.
Yeah. Any damage to the car that occurred when towing occurred, for sure.
Right.
Scratches, dings, dents. The amount of bail to get the car out of hock. Yep.
Right.
They have to pay for that. And any attorney's fees. Okay. If they were necessary. The HOA, and it could be a private person calling the tow company, but it's the same liability, okay? If it's a wrongful tow, then the person who called is going to be on the hook for that.
Right.
Okay, so you got to make sure it's right. Don't hesitate to tow somebody that's in your spot or blocking your driveway.
Right. No, yeah.
Tow the heck out of them. Get rid of them. Did you know that you see this on these shows, these towing shows, these reality shows? There's a myth out there, though. It's like as soon as they drop their rig and they hook the car up,
Oh, I've heard that, yeah.
it's the whole bail. Yeah. No, it's not under California law. Under California law, once they hook up, once you're connected, which is why they do it so quickly, half. It becomes whole as soon as they roll away. As soon as they start moving, then it's the whole. So if somebody would jump in there and go, stop, and they had already rolled their wheel, now it's the whole, I'll unhook it, but you got to pay the whole bail right there and then. But if you get out there right when they've latched it, they can charge you half the bail.
Oh, interesting.
Okay? And they can do that. That is built into the law, which is why those tow people drop their rigs and move it back, and they're racing to get it chained up because the second it's chained, they can charge. And they know that. Because if somebody comes out before that, they can't finish the hookup. Just because you drop the rig doesn't mean that it's hooked up yet. They can somebody can come out and move the car.
Interesting.
But if they hook up, they connect.
Yeah.
Then it's half. and then the person can't make them unhook it for free.
Okay.
And they'll stand their ground, trust me, because that's how they make their money. Okay, so they can tow. And they can also, within reason, unlike that example we just gave, they can, within reason, regulate.
Right.
Okay. Some neighborhoods, when there's 3-car garages, they require you to park at least 2 cars in the garage before you're allowed to use your driveway. Then they require you to fill up your driveway before you're allowed to use the street. They have rules like that. Those are enforceable. As long as they're not enforcing it against you, and you, but not these people because we like them. They can't do that. Okay? Now, what do you do? How do you push back when your HOA is being crazy like this other HOA? Okay? What do you do? What do you push back? How do you push back? Well, somebody's trying to enforce a regulation on you. First question you ask is, please identify where in the governing documents this regulation is so that you can read it for yourself. You need to see whether or not they're interpreting it right. There's a good shot they're not. I'll give you another example. There was a debate in one of our clients' cases over whether or not a Sprinter van was considered a recreational vehicle within the meaning of the rules and regulations. Well, in this particular case, the HOA could not enforce because the Sprinter van, they didn't bother going far enough. A Sprinter van by itself is not a recreational vehicle. A Sprinter van that's being converted, that they put a bed in, that they've got a kitchen or a partial kitchen, now it's a conversion, now it's an RV. Even if they use it every day, it's still an RV. They didn't have the specificity necessary. So ask for the citation to the specific provision, whether it's in your rules or CC&Rs or both. Ask for that and go check yourself. Read it for yourself. 2, demand due process. Okay, if you weren't offered a hearing before fine, that's illegal. Fine's not enforceable. You can't fine without a hearing, period, end of story. So you want your due process. If you show up at the hearing and they won't tell you who complained and they aren't showing you video or pictures, then you're not getting due process. It's going to be, you could challenge that enforceability. Okay? And if the fine is excessive, challenge. So what is excessive? It's hard to put a number on it. It depends on a lot of factors, but you kind of get your gut reaction. $175 for parking for a minute in front of your driveway, to me, is excessive. I don't think that's reasonable.
It has to be proportionate. It has to make sense.
Has to make sense.
Yeah.
If it doesn't make sense, challenge that. And if that won't work, that's when you come to us.
Yeah.
Okay? Because the law doesn't define what is or isn't excessive, but it's like one of those things that we kind of know when we see it. Okay? And if we are pretty confident, then you should be confident. Okay?
Also ensuring that that's not arbitrary and selective. Is there a fine schedule or policy that identifies that?
Right. But even if there is, let's say the board let's say they passed a fine schedule that started at $1,200.
Oh, yeah, no, unreasonable.
No,
on its
you can't
face.
do that. It's ridiculous. So, I think $175 for a first offense parking fine is excessive. It's my opinion, but I think I'd win on that, just based on my experience. Now, let's talk about public streets for a minute, because that was an issue you brought up, okay? And public streets are broken into two parts. Okay, if you have, let's say, a gated community, okay, and the streets inside are privately owned and the streets outside the gate are publicly owned, the HOA is not going to be able to enforce any regulations on those public streets outside the confines of the HOA. They have no say, period. Okay, but if the streets within your HOA, within your community, are public, that is, your HOA either only has a couple of privates, but the public ones are in the confines of your community. They're within the common area. Okay? They might not be owned by the HOA, but they have maintenance responsibilities because the city has imposed that on them. But it's within the geographic confines of the surrounding common area. Then the HOA can, even though they're public streets, can impose reasonable regulations. So, for example, the municipal code might allow RV parking on public streets. But if those public streets are located within your HOA, then your board can say no RV parking on those public streets. And somebody else that doesn't live in your community, because remember, this one wouldn't be gated, right? They could drive their RV in your community and park on a public street, and the HOA couldn't do a thing about it. That could happen. Okay? Those sort of things, even though it's a public street, the HOA does have some authority. Mm-hmm. But it is much more limited than it is if it's private streets. Okay? So I'm not going to go so far as to say they can't stop you from doing what you want on a public street and the municipal code rules, because that's not altogether true. But it isn't really something that comes up a lot. We've seen it. I've seen it a couple times. I've seen it where they wanted to ban RV parking, and people were complaining because people lived outside the community were parking there with RVs, and it wasn't fair. Well, it's too bad.
Yeah.
They don't live in your HOA. They aren't subject to your governing documents. You are. Do I think that's right? No, I don't. I think that if the HOA wants to have control, they should buy the streets, and then they should be private streets. And if they don't, too bad. They lose that one element of control. That's my opinion, though. It's not what the law is. Okay? So, in other words, HOA has less power than regulating a public street than they would a private street, mm-hmm. but they have some power. Okay?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right. And if you failed at due process, if the fines are unreasonable or excessive, if the wrong itself was illegal or excessive or wrong, or if they violated the law, for example, towing, mm-hmm. come to us. MBK Chapman will set your HOA straight. That's what we do.
Yeah.
Okay? So from outright bans on certain vehicles mm-hmm. to banning parking in certain areas to being crazy ridiculous when it comes to surveillance, mm-hmm. these parking wars are something that happens every day. The interactions between homeowners, their vehicles, and the HOA is something that rears its head every day. It's frequent, and it's something that you guys should be somewhat familiar with, because only with that familiarity you'll be able to protect your rights and at least push back when pushing back is required. Because I think we all agree that some parking regulations are good mm-hmm. because it prevents the worst in us from allowing them to lower your property values. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it prevents the kind of abuse that we saw in this HOA in San Jose. And it prevents the kind of abuses that we at MBK Chapman see all the time. So be vigilant, know your governing documents, ask specific questions, make sure that things are being done unselectively, so fairly applied to everybody, and make sure your HOA isn't just making stuff up. If the rules don't seem reasonable to you, they might not be reasonable at all. Mm-hmm. And that's when you can ask or look around for information or come to us. Right. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button. And if you haven't already done so, I'd love you to subscribe to the channel. If you want to leave a comment, we always love to hear from you. We do read those. Until next time.